They said it was too dangerous, too powerful, too unpredictable for the streets. Yamaha's VMAX didn't just break the rules, it terrified regulators, spooked insurers, and sparked a cult following that refused to let it die. But why was this motorcycle quietly blacklisted around the world? And what are they still not telling us? The muscle bike that shouldn't exist. Yamaha was told it couldn't be done, that no one would buy a motorcycle so powerful, so aggressive, so completely unhinged from everything the industry thought a bike should be. But in 1985, Yamaha didn't just build that bike. They unleashed the VMAX, and it would go on to burn its name into the asphalt of motorcycle history. At first glance, the VMAX looked like it was built in a garage by a mad scientist. A 1,197cc liquid-cooled V4 engine sat like a warhead between its frame rails, promising destruction on demand. That engine produced 145 horsepower, a number that, at the time, sounded more like a mistake than a spec sheet. But it wasn't. That was real power. And Yamaha wasn't finished. Beneath its air scoops and steel muscles, the VMAX carried a secret weapon, a technology Yamaha called V-Boost. Starting at around 5,750 revolutions per minute, butterfly valves opened between the intake manifolds, sucking in more air, ramping up combustion, and launching the bike like it had a second engine hidden inside. The VMAX didn't accelerate, it attacked. Riders could tear down a quarter mile in just over 10 seconds, a performance that dropped it squarely into the drag racing elite. And this wasn't on a track. This was a showroom bike, available to anyone with the courage or recklessness to twist the throttle. But not everyone was cheering. The VMAX's dominance in straight lines came at a price. Its handling was a known weakness. The suspension was soft, the weight was high, and in corners, it felt more like you were muscling around a tank than carving through a curve. Riders who treated it like a sport bike quickly learned their mistake. Yet for its fans, and there were many, these flaws weren't deal breakers. They were quirks, the kind of traits you accepted in exchange for the thrill of riding something that felt barely street legal, something that sounded like thunder and moved like lightning. Yamaha didn't want to build another safe, efficient cruiser. They wanted to build a two-wheeled muscle car, and that's exactly what they delivered. Its styling reflected that philosophy. With those signature air scoops, its muscular frame, and a stance that looked ready to charge even when parked, the VMAX wasn't a bike you rode casually. It was a machine that demanded your full attention. And once you gave it that, it gave you something no other production motorcycle at the time could: pure, violent speed under your full control. The bike quickly became a symbol of defiance, a cultural icon for riders who weren't interested in blending in. It inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. It was the kind of machine that got you noticed, on the street and in the media. Not because it was pretty, but because it was unapologetically excessive. Mechanics respected it. Beginners feared it. Veterans told stories about it like war tales. The VMAX didn't just push boundaries, it erased them. And while other manufacturers cautiously tiptoed around performance limits, Yamaha was willing to risk everything to build something that would be talked about for decades. That risk paid off. The VMAX became a benchmark in muscle bike history, and even today, its name alone commands instant recognition. By the time it was retired in 2020, it had already secured its place in the pantheon of legendary machines. But in 1985, it was still an experiment, a gamble, a mechanical dare aimed at anyone brave enough to take the keys. And the craziest part? Yamaha almost didn't release it. Internal debates raged about whether the VMAX was too dangerous, too extreme, too far outside what the brand was known for. But when it finally hit showroom floors, all those fears were silenced by the roar of that V4 engine. The VMAX wasn't just a bike, it was a line in the sand. And anyone who crossed it did so knowing they weren't riding for comfort or style points or practicality. They were riding for power, unfiltered, unrelenting, unapologetic. Too fast to ignore performance stats. They tried to hide. There are fast bikes, and then there's the Yamaha VMAX, a machine that didn't just break speed records, it shattered expectations. It wasn't built to be subtle, it was built to dominate. Let's start with the numbers. A 1,197cc liquid-cooled V4 engine. That's what powered the first VMAX back in 1985, and from that beast came 145 horsepower. a figure that left most bikes in the dust and raised more than a few eyebrows at the time. These weren't numbers you typically saw on something meant for the street. This was muscle car territory. But power without delivery is just noise. The VMAX delivered. From a standstill, this monster could hit 60 miles per hour in just 2.65 seconds. That's supercar quick. And we're talking about a motorcycle from the mid-80s. In the quarter mile, the VMS clocked in at 10.29 seconds, dropping jaws and leaving rubber on drag strips across the country. These weren't inflated brochure stats. These were real-world numbers that earned it respect and fear in equal measure. But it wasn't just about what it could do. It was how it did it. The VMAX didn't ease into speed. It lunged. It exploded off the line with so much torque that riders were often warned, hold on tight or don't ride at all. No. Of course, this kind of performance came with weight. The original VMAX had a dry weight of around 271 kilograms, or roughly 597 pounds. That mass made it incredibly stable in straight-line runs, but it also meant that in tight corners or rapid direction changes, the bike could feel heavy, even sluggish. Riders had to work with the VMAX, not against it, to unlock its full potential. And that put it in a very specific category. Not a sport bike, not a cruiser, but something else entirely. When it hit the streets, it didn't have many direct rivals, but comparisons were inevitable. The Honda V65 Magna, for example, had about 100 horsepower and ran the quarter mile in roughly 11 seconds. Strong, but not VMAX territory. Then there was the Suzuki Madura 1200, pumping out around 90 horsepower. Impressive for a cruiser, but still outclassed by Yamaha's flagship Brute. These comparisons weren't even close. The VMAX stood in a league of its own. That's why people started calling it something else entirely, the two-wheeled muscle car. It was a nickname that stuck, and for good reason. Yamaha designed the VMAX with American muscle in mind, long, low, and aggressive. It wasn't just a bike, it was a visual warning. The air scoops, the stance, the sheer presence. It looked fast, even when standing still. It captured something more than speed. It captured attitude. This design philosophy, paired with brutal acceleration, meant the VMAX found a natural home in drag racing culture. Street racers loved it. On long, straight roads, it was nearly unbeatable. Twist the throttle and you were gone. No wind-up, no drama, just instant, neck-snapping force. And word spread quickly. Soon, the VMAX was turning up not just on tracks, but in underground racing circles, where its reputation only grew. You didn't need to explain what the VMAX was. If you showed up with one, people already knew. But that kind of reputation came with a darker edge, because while the VMAX could outrun almost anything in a straight line, it had clear limits, and those who didn't respect those limits sometimes paid the price. Its hefty weight and soft suspension made it a challenge in corners. Riders who tried to treat it like a sport bike, cutting hard lines, leaning deep, often found themselves in trouble. Still, for many, this was part of the thrill. It wasn't a machine you mastered in a day. It was something you had to learn, something you had to tame. And once you did, it became more than a bike, it became a statement. Even as reviewers pointed out its cornering flaws, they couldn't deny the VMAX's dominance in its lane. Yamaha had never promised a track-ready machine. They had promised a muscle bike, shaped, and they delivered exactly that. In fact, the VMAX's shortcomings became part of its legend. Riders shared tips on how to adjust the suspension, tweak the ergonomics, even mod the frame for better balance. Forums were filled with discussions, not about whether the VMAX was perfect, but about how to ride it right. And at the heart of all those conversations was a single truth. This bike was never meant to play nice. It was designed to punch hard, run fast, and leave everyone else wondering what just passed them. And in that mission, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Even today, the VMAX is remembered not just for its specs, but for how it made people feel. The roar of the V4, the blast of acceleration, the respect it commanded at every stoplight. It wasn't subtle, and it didn't want to be. That's why it was loved. And that's why, decades later, it's still being talked about, not just as a fast bike, but as one of the most important performance motorcycles ever built. Because when the VMAX arrived, everything else suddenly looked a little slower. The legal war against the VMAX. Not every motorcycle gets banned, but not every motorcycle is the Yamaha VMAX. From the moment it hit the streets, the VMAX wasn't just powerful, it was provocative. And soon, it wasn't just riders taking notice. Regulators, insurers, and even dealerships started asking the same question. Should this machine even be allowed on public roads? Let's begin in Europe, where the VMAX faced its first major wall. In the United Kingdom, the bike was never officially imported until 1991, and when it finally arrived, it came neutered, capped at 100 brake horsepower, with its signature V-boost system completely stripped out. That wasn't a choice Yamaha made for fun. It was a requirement to get the VMAX past regulators who saw the full power version as too extreme for British roads, and that pattern repeated in other regions. In Ontario, Canada, insurance companies quietly blacklisted the VMAX. It wasn't an official government ban, but it might as well have been. If you couldn't get insurance, you couldn't legally ride it, and many companies simply refused to cover the model at all. Riders found themselves in a legal limbo, owning a machine they couldn't register or protect. And that wasn't just a Canadian quirk. Across North America, the VMAX regularly appeared on no-go lists. Informal rosters compiled by insurers of bikes they considered too risky, too powerful, or too expensive to cover. The VMAX checked all three boxes. Its raw performance, reputation for aggressive riding, and high repair costs made it a red flag for underwriters. This wasn't just a bike, it was a liability. Even dealers weren't always eager to stock it. While the VMAX had fans, it also had a reputation. Some dealerships saw it as a lawsuit waiting to happen. Its handling quirks and sheer horsepower raised concerns about inexperienced riders biting off more than they could chew. And when you combine raw speed with limited cornering finesse, things can go wrong fast. Then came the recalls. In 2009, Yamaha issued a recall on certain VMAX models due to a wiring defect that could destabilize the engine's idle speed. The issue? Excessive resistance in the ground wiring of key sensors, which could cause erratic throttle behavior and increase the risk of a crash. Yamaha acted quickly, but it added fuel to the fire for critics who were already calling the VMAX unsafe for everyday use. And just a few years later, Europe delivered the final blow. By 2016, the VMAX could no longer be sold in European markets. Not because of accidents, not because of performance, but because of pollution. The bike couldn't meet Euro 4 emission standards, and Yamaha declined to redesign the engine to comply. That meant the VMAX was quietly pulled from showrooms, not for what it could do, but for what it couldn't avoid: regulation. It was a fitting end to a legacy of resistance. But the legal pushback didn't stop at borders and recalls. Online, the VMAX earned a shadowy reputation. Riders across forums and communities spoke about it being difficult to insure, hard to register, and in some places nearly impossible to legally modify. Whether these stories were policy or myth, they were consistent. The VMAX was always skating the edge of what the system allowed. Even in places where it wasn't formally banned, owners found themselves jumping through hoops just to stay compliant. In several European markets, factory-imposed power restrictions dropped the VMAX down to just 100 brake horsepower, but riders weren't having it. They found ways, mechanical and digital, to bypass those limits, restoring the bike to its full power potential. Yamaha's beast had been chained, but owners wanted it free. It was a constant back and forth between performance and permission. And yet, the controversy only made the legend stronger, because unlike most bikes, the VMAX was never just about riding. It was about rebellion, about pushing past what the law, the street, or even the machine itself was supposed to allow. It was a performance icon forced to live in a world that wasn't built to handle it. Some saw it as irresponsible. Others called it misunderstood. But no one, not fans, not critics, not regulators, ever called it boring. The legal battles the VMAX faced weren't the result of a design flaw or a marketing misfire. They were a direct result of how radical it was. Yamaha had built something the world hadn't seen before, and once it arrived, there wasn't an easy way to fit it into the rulebook. Dealers hesitated, insurers balked, governments restricted, and yet the riders kept showing up. Because what those regulators called dangerous, fans called exhilarating. What insurance companies flagged as a risk, VMAX owners saw as proof of power, and what the law tried to rein in, they were proud to unleash. This wasn't a motorcycle you rode to blend in. It was a motorcycle that made a scene just by existing, and maybe that was the real threat all along. The riders who worshipped it and the accidents that changed everything. It didn't matter what critics said, or what lawmakers wrote, or what the insurance companies blacklisted. The Yamaha VMAX had already found its people. From the moment it hit the road, the VMAX built not just a fan base, but a following. Riders didn't just buy it, they believed in it, and it wasn't hard to see why. This was a bike that combined cruiser comfort with raw, unfiltered performance, a blend no one had seen before, and one few manufacturers dared to replicate. It didn't handle like a sport bike. It didn't ride like a Harley. It did its own thing, and that thing was power. Within just a few years of its release, the VMAX had become a legend, not just in magazines, but in garages and late-night parking lot meetups. It was the kind of machine you recognized by sound, and the people who wrote it wore that sound like armor. But for VMAX fans, factory specs were just the beginning. Customization became a ritual, from exhaust swaps to engine mods, body kits to boosted intakes. Riders treated the VMAX like a canvas, a dangerous, beautiful canvas. Some built for show, others for speed, and some for both. Among the most iconic creations was JVB Moto's yard-built VMAX, Infrared, a fully reimagined version that stripped the bike down to its core and rebuilt it into something fierce, futuristic, and unforgettable. That wasn't a one-off. Across Europe, the US, and Japan, custom VMAX builds became a subculture of their own. Forums exploded with tuning guides. DIY riders swapped stories and schematics. This wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a movement, and at the heart of that movement was the look. Even stock, the VMAX had a silhouette that felt more comic book than showroom. Wide, muscular, aggressive. It looked ready for war. The massive V4 engine, the signature air scoops, the long, low stance, all of it screamed power, even at a standstill. It became an icon, not because it was refined, but because it wasn't. But icon status has a price. As the VMAX grew more popular and more powerful, so did the list of riders who couldn't handle it. The bike's acceleration was unforgiving. Its braking demanded experience, and its weight, while stabilizing in a straight line, made quick maneuvers risky, if not downright dangerous. There were crashes, and not just minor ones. Stories began circulating in online forums of riders losing control, often in high-speed scenarios where the VMAX's limitations suddenly showed. One rider, attempting a pass on a highway curve, lost control mid-throttle and went down hard. The injuries were severe, and the conversation that followed was louder than ever. Was the VMAX too much for public roads? Some said yes. Some said it depended on the rider. But no one denied that this bike demanded respect. It wasn't built for beginners, and in the wrong hands, it could turn deadly. Lawmakers took notice. Across safety boards and riding communities, the VMAX came up again and again. Its weight, its torque, its launch speed all became talking points in debates about street safety. Was it fair to sell something this extreme to the general public? The debate got louder after Yamaha issued recalls. One such recall involved a critical oil pump issue that could lead to complete engine failure mid-ride. If that happened at speed, and with a bike like the VMAX, you were always at speed, the results could be catastrophic. Yamaha corrected the issue, but the recall only strengthened public fears. Was this machine too dangerous to exist? Then came the headlines. Media outlets began calling the VMAX a death machine. Some documentaries, YouTube reviewers, and even major press painted it as the motorcycle equivalent of a ticking time bomb. Thrilling, yes, but also volatile. It was the kind of nickname you couldn't shake. Supercharged VMAX, 240 GP. Would you ride this? I hate the Yamaha VMAX, and here's why. These weren't just dramatic titles. They reflected a real tension between admiration and fear. And yet, the fear only seemed to fuel the legend. Because for every headline warning people away, there was a rider itching to prove them wrong. For every crash, there was a survivor tuning their VMAX even further. For every critic who called it reckless, there were 10 riders who called it honest. This wasn't a bike that promised safety, it promised power, and with that promise came responsibility. It became a kind of unofficial badge. Owning a VMAX meant you weren't afraid to take on something raw, imperfect, and dangerously alive. You knew the risks, you accepted the weight, and when you twisted that throttle, you did it knowing full well what you were unleashing. For some riders, that's exactly what they wanted. And for the rest of the world, well, they could call it reckless. They could call it overkill. They could even call it a death machine. But to the riders who worshipped it, the VMAX was none of those things. It was a challenge, a legacy, a beast that demanded control, and rewarded it with adrenaline most bikes could only dream of. Let them write the warnings. The VMAX didn't need their approval. What killed the VMAX and why it may come back? The Yamaha VMAX didn't die quietly. It was retired, but never forgotten. After 35 years of production, the final VMAX rolled off the line in 2020, and just like that, a legend was parked. But the story didn't end because riders stopped loving it. In fact, demand remained steady. It ended because the world around it changed, and the VMAX refused to. In a world shifting towards sleek efficiency and clean emissions, the VMAX was loud, heavy, and unapologetically excessive. The kind of motorcycle that would rather be feared than approved. And that's where the problem started. One of the biggest forces working against the VMAX wasn't a competitor, it was regulation. Stricter emissions laws, especially in Europe, made it almost impossible for the VMAX's V4 engine to survive. With Euro 5 standards looming, Yamaha faced a decision: completely redesign the bike to meet environmental compliance, or shut it down. Updating the VMAX would have meant re-engineering its soul, and for a machine that was already a niche product, the investment just didn't make sense. So Yamaha let it go, not because it had lost its place, but because the rules had outgrown it. And Europe wasn't the only battleground. In the US, Yamaha had already been hit with a $2.2 million settlement for selling uncertified off-road vehicles, bringing its emission scrutiny into sharp focus. While that wasn't directly tied to the VMAX, it reflected a broader pressure. The world was watching, and muscle bikes like the VMAX were no longer easy to defend. This wasn't about performance anymore, it was about compliance. But here's the twist. Even as production halted, the myth didn't fade. Across forums, rider clubs, and speculative concept videos, one question keeps echoing louder than ever. What if the VMAX came back as an electric? It sounds like a contradiction. The VMAX was all growl and gasoline, torque and thunder. How could it ever be reborn as a silent, battery-powered machine? But the motorcycle world is changing fast. Electric bikes are getting stronger, lighter, and bolder. And if there's any bike begging for a high-voltage second life, it's the VMAX. Rumors of a Gen 3 VMAX have been quietly circulating for years. Enthusiasts point to leaked patents, concept designs, and Yamaha's recent moves in electric development. Some of the mock-ups floating around, they're stunning. They reimagine the VMAX as a futuristic powerhouse. Still muscular, still aggressive, but now powered by a state-of-the-art electric drivetrain. It's all speculation. Yamaha hasn't officially confirmed anything, but the conversation is real. The desire is there. The demand is simmering. And maybe that's the point, because the VMAX has never been a bike you build to match trends. It's a bike you build when you want to shock the world, when you want to throw down a gauntlet, when you want to prove that muscle, in whatever form it takes, still matters. So what do you think? Was the VMAX a masterpiece ahead of its time, or a monster that had to be tamed? Maybe you've seen one, maybe you've ridden one, or maybe this is the first time you've heard the real story. Either way, if this machine gave you chills, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more motorcycles they never wanted you to know about.